harder air sight.
All right, so back to this. Should I write some notes? Because it's really how it works. There's not much, there's a few other nuances. Well, just remember that drawing right there if you run into trouble. Just remember that. It's embarrassment. In my mind, it was going to work out. All right, let's see. See principles of operation. All right, principles of operation. So we have the one. Battery supplies, 12 volts. Supplies 12 volts to a primary coil. Points open and close. Points open and close. What opens and closes the points? Okay. Via a cam driven off of what? The cam shaft.
I was about to say that. No, can't do that.
Off the cam shaft. Okay, the cam shaft. Which it's often we just say cam. We don't say the whole word camshaft, but I'm trying to be careful now because we're talking about the little points cam and the cam shaft, so we'll try and keep them separate. So the cam shaft turns at 1/2 crank speed. Crankshaft. Oops. Crankshaft speed. And is directly I'm going to say linked to what is happening, in the cylinders. Remember, it's the brains of the operation. And the crank does not know what's happening in the cylinder. It knows up and it knows down. Are you on the intake, exhaust, compression? Intake, exhaust, compression. What am I missing? Intake, power. There you go. Power. It doesn't know. I don't know either. So, So crankshaft doesn't know. It knows you're up, knows when it's down. That's it. I'm not saying that. When the points open, the primary field collapses quickly. Well, those buttons work. Dude, that's terrible. What happened? Zoom. Pause. All right, when the points open, the primary, what was I writing? Field, primary field? Yeah, I know that's what happens with when the points open, the primary field. Leaving it. First it was really cool. The primary I could read the manual, but I don't want to get all crazy about it. So points open. The primary field collapses rapidly. And let's see. So this rapid change, this rapid collapse, induces a voltage in the secondary of 12,000 to 40,000 volts. All right, so when you're doing an oral and you're explaining this, the more I explain here, the more I expect you to have a more nuanced understanding. So to make sure we're all on the same page here, at least with this one, when the points are closed and current flows through the primary, that current is flowing, it causes a magnetic field from the primary to expand out across the secondary. Yep. When the point's open, the primary field rapidly collapses, which that rapid collapse of the primary magnetic field is magnetism changing across or movement across a coil, which was the secondary. So that induces a voltage, a current flow voltage in the secondary that then travels off to distributor and spark plugs. You will get a voltage of 12 to 40,000 volts. Well, that's an awful big range. How do I know which one you're going to get? Well, funny thing about that is we could bring that number way down if we wanted to. The amount of voltage you get depends upon how big of a gap it has to jump. So it's only going to build up voltage until current flows. So if you actually made this a very tiny little gap right there, you would get on the very low end of voltage. Or if we didn't even have a gap, we just ran a wire across, you wouldn't get a whole lot of voltage. I mean, it's still good enough. I wouldn't want to mess with it, but that's what depends on the voltage. If you bring the spark plug apart, it has to jump a gap, then it builds up in the secondary until it has to jump that gap. If you move it too far apart, you won't get enough voltage in the secondary to jump that gap, and it tries to find something else to jump across, and it will find the weakest point in the system. So that's why I say with your magnetos, or especially magnetos, you don't run them without something connected to the secondary, because it will find a place to arc in there if it can.
You don't have a safety gap?
No, they don't.
When you say something connected, you mean like
A wire going to a ground or a gap or something. Give it a place to discharge. Because if you don't, it's going to start discharging through the coil. It'll break down the coil and start arcing out the coil into some metal somewhere. Well, once you break through the coil and you start arcing through the coil's no good. And then eventually it'll weaken it to the point where that's where it wants to fire, and you're in the air flying along, and it won't fire spark plugs anymore. It'll just fire out the coil. Go, this is much easier. Hey, why didn't we do this sooner? It's also worth noting that if you look at this spark plug gap for an engine, your gap is not very big. It's 0.018 is about the average gap. And when you look at the magneto test machine and you look at the gap between those things it's got a spark across, it's a pretty healthy gap. So why aren't we testing it at 0.018 where it has to operate?
You can't really see it.
Yeah, you couldn't see it. Not a bad answer, actually. But the answer is this. Inside of a cylinder where you have a 0.018 gap, remember, air is an insulator. So if I had a spark plug and I take it out and I just, I ran a magneto here or in the lab and I just sparked the 0.018 gap, it's only got to jump across so many oxygen and air molecules in there, right? But when we put it in a piston in a cylinder, not a piston, put it in a cylinder, and that piston comes up and compresses all of that air, we have this much air, and we compressed it to that. That's a lot of air right there. So yeah, it no longer looks like it's a 0.018 gap electrically. It looks like it's a much bigger gap electrically. It has to jump that because there's so much air packed in there. So that's why, yeah.
The coils, it's like a transformer. It's happening.
It is a transformer.
Okay.
Yeah, we call it a coil.
Okay, and the arc happens when we shut it off. When it's like
In the context of it.
correct.
Yeah, when the point's open.
Okay.
This right here is just the switch inside of the cockpit there.
Because it has to release all the energy to.
Somewhere, which is a spark plug, right?
What are we talking about here?
When you disconnect power from the cam, when it's like.
Right here, the breaker points?
Yeah.
Yes, when that opens, yeah, you've killed off the power because this is now an open.
Okay, so that voltage has to move out.
From the secondary.
From the primary, it just dissipates out. It goes into the coil and then dies off. It's just an open circuit. Just so the battery voltage just stops.
And then I think he's asking, when does the secondary,
That is the idea,
And then the secondary gets its voltage the second these breaker points open.
got
As
it.
soon as the breaker points start to open, the primary collapses. And as soon as that primary collapses, boom, 20,000 volts.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is, on our test stand in the lab, is that gap equivalent to the amount of air that's been compressed into the .018 gap?
I don't know if it correlates exactly. That's if you, and we should do this tomorrow if somebody has time. If you read the overhaul manual for the Bendix, it tells you exactly how big those gaps are supposed to be. And they're supposed to be calibrated. I did it a few years ago. I forget the exact number.
I want to look at that's for things from O'Reilly's and I use that.
Need 6 of them.
When you say you have a range of the voltage and it's kind of dependent on what the spark plug is for, so like if you're creating 20,000 volts for a spark plug that's only 15,000 volts, are you still going to get that 20,000 through it?
Okay, so the amount of voltage that the secondary will produce is how much it needs to produce to jump the gap.
Okay.
So you got to think about it. It builds up, builds up, builds up, builds up, and as soon as it can jump the gap, it will. You know, it's all the electrons are standing there at the edge of the gap, and they're all pushing behind, and that electron's not going to jump until it's got enough pressure behind it. It goes, now I can make it, and it jumps across, and then they all follow.
Got it.
And then different spark plugs require different voltage to spark?
They don't.
Okay.
They'll have different gaps, and because they have a different gap,
Oh, got it.
it will be more or less voltage.
Okay.
So the secondary windings would have an effect on that? If there's more secondary, essentially we learned that primary windings versus secondary windings are proportional to the voltage in the primary versus the voltage in the secondary.
It is, but how do I say this? So maybe it's designed to produce this step-up voltage. It's if you did the math, you go, wow, it's like 50,000 volts. It's not going to produce 50, only produce 20 because it's only got to jump a gap that far. Move the gap out to something that takes 50,000, it'll put out 50,000, but it's only going to produce the amount of voltage it needs to get across that gap. Once it jumps the gap, it's flowing and it dissipates.
How does it know when to jump the gap?
Because then,
It's just how much voltage it takes to jump a particular gap. So it's, I don't know, we could think about lightning. You know, you can kind of feel the electricity in the air, but how come you don't get a lightning bolt? It's because it's still building up enough electricity to jump from the cloud down or earth up, whichever way it tends to go. Negative to positive, positive, negative. I don't know. Yeah. So if we actually took a wire right here and just kind of grounded it out, this would not be 20,000 volts. I don't know, maybe 1,000. I don't actually know the answer, but it would just be like, it would just dissipate into ground. Like, there's nothing to jump. So you're not going to get a lot of voltage built up.
almost like a capacitor, like the spark plugs.
Sure.
Cathode resistance.
But it's worth noting that if for some reason you get a breakdown in any of the wires, and of course these wires over here are your spark plug wires, if any one of them, if I made this gap too big, boy, I'm building up 50,000 volts, and it finds a way to arc through, because you know all of these wires, if you think about your car, they're running right next to metal. And so if there's any way for that spark instead of going across to the spark plug, which sees it as a big gap, it's easier to go right to the engine block. It'll do it. It'll absolutely do it. That goes anywhere. So, just zaps right through, and now it'll start zapping through right there. If it did it on one cylinder, that cylinder starts missing. It's like, well, I'm running on 3. Well, how come you're running on 3? Well, because it's arcing outside of the cylinder against the crankcase or something like that, and that's very bad. And that's really what that buzz box that you guys are using to test stuff in the lab, the magneto, the E35 tester. That's what that's designed for, is to put a high voltage and let you check that. All right.
Is it an oscilloscope ever used for troubleshooting aircraft engines?
Nope. Yeah, so what he's talking about, it was cool. Back in the old days, you would have a... What's that? When I was in high school, we had one. Well, it was. I had a 79 Toyota truck, and it was a cool truck. And I'd take it into, shop class, and I always put it on the old oscilloscope, if you will. And there's all these terms that we're not getting into, but you had your dwell and the spark advance, and it had oscilloscope, and it would tell you all this stuff. Geez, I don't remember the names. Dwell was how long the point stayed closed, and so you'd check the timing on that, and that would tell you how the cam, if it's worn out or not, when it sparked, was it advancing, were they all even? I mean, there was all this stuff you do, but you just don't do that anymore. Now you just get a code and a little light blinks at you, check engine, the guy sticks a computer on and goes, it's number 3 coil. Well, how do you know it's number 3 coil? Trust me, machine.
That's what the code says.
That's what the code says.
Just replace the number 3 coil.
Let's see. Okay. 5, the voltage travels by a large wire to the distributor. Let's see, the voltage travels via a large wire from the coil assembly to the distributor. So in this style ignition, the coil is just a round thing about that big around, about that tall, and you'll see some wires just coming into it, and then right in the middle is a big old fat wire that looks like it's a spark plug wire, but it just goes across right to the middle of the distributor. Just there it is. So if you change spark plug wires and you had a car like this, if you had an 8-cylinder, they give you 9 wires. One of them's just that long. What's the short one for? Well, that's the coil to the middle of the distributor. It plugged in right in the middle. I remember that because my neighbor one time came and got me. He's like, "Hey man, something's wrong with my truck. I can't shut it off. Key didn't work or something." He's like, "I can't let it sit here and run all night." I'm like, "Well, I guess you could just unplug. I guess you could just pull the coil wire." That was a huge mistake. He hated me from that day on because it shocked the living crap out of him because he grabbed onto it and it went through the shielding into his hand for a little while. And we were never friends after that. I'm like, oh, or you could just pull the ECM circuit breaker. That's what we should have done. Yeah, the fuel pump breaker. That would have worked even better. Let's see.
Just get up to a wall, put it in the gear. Let go of the clutch.
It'll stop.
The distributor, or distributor if you want to call it, is driven off the same shaft as the breaker cam. The breaker cam. And distributor, and points to the cylinder to be fired. So look at that little finger, just drives around, it goes fired you, then fire that one, then fire that one, then fire that one. It's like the old Trump, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired. I don't know, I mentioned Trump, all right, sorry. A condenser or capacitor is installed in parallel with the points. And this gives electrons an alternate path, a temporary, I like that better, a temporary, alternate path when the point's open. That helps to rapidly collapse the field. And keeps points from arcing. And this process is repeated for each cylinder. This process is repeated for each cylinder. So this style actually has a spark advance to it. Almost explain it like using one of these. So it has this plate, or it has that finger that's attached to a shaft that's going to the camshaft, and so that's driving the shaft, comes up, and that finger's going around, right, you're firing, you're firing, you're firing. And that shaft is locked to the cam shaft, but it's kind of set up like this, like there's this, like a drive, so it's driving, and the finger's like on a spring, similar to this, but we can control that. And so using flyweights, and it's different, but using flyweights, which would sense engine speed, or a vacuum that goes to the manifold, we can actually take and change the position of this plate relative to the shaft that's running off the cam shaft. And so by doing that, you can actually move that plate just a little bit one way, which might be advancing. So that finger actually, instead of being locked to the shaft right here, it kind of rotated this way. So it's a little bit more advanced, or you can take it the other way, a little bit more retarded. So I don't need to get too much in that, but just know that using flyweights or vacuum advance, or vacuum, you can advance that plate on there, and that's what would change things. When you checked, anybody ever checked timing with the timing light on a car?
Yeah.
So, I remember doing it I had a Chevy truck. I don't do it to this car for some reason. I know, tried it. Yeah, my last car, I couldn't do anything to that damn thing. At 100,000 miles, like, well, you need to change spark plugs. I'm like, I'm really busy, I don't have time for it. What's that going to run me? There's only 6 of them. And they're like, well, I'll be $800. Are you freaking kidding me?
Sounds like I'm doing it myself.
Yeah, I am doing it myself. And so I took my car home, I popped the hood. After about 20 minutes of not finding a single spark plug, I finally went and I bought the book, and I'm like, you got to do what? To take apart the entire intake system. And there was like 50 some O-rings in there. I'm like, oh, I'm not getting this back.
What did you want?
It was Mercedes ML350.
Yeah.
So I called them up, like, 800, huh? That's a hell of a good deal. I don't know how you're getting. I do not know how you're changing plugs on this for $800, but you can do it.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, why so cheap? But Thankfully, I've got an old, I have an 85 Mastercraft. It's got a Ford 351 in it, which, it's old school. In fact, it's almost got this style, but it did when it came out of the factory, but somebody took and put electronic ignition inside of that little cap. But, it's the same thing. You go out there and, use a little timing light and set it all up. So, all right. So in automotive, I'll put in automotive use. Timing is advanced. Advanced by use of flyweights, or vacuum. In essence, the cam and distributor finger, or the breaker cam, the breaker cam and distributor finger are rotated to fire earlier in relation to cam, to camshaft position. And this is true of anything. When you advance the spark happens earlier as that piston is coming up. As that happens, it creates more pressure as the piston comes up. More pressure is going to equal more power. So you can get more power out of something by advancing the spark. You do it until the point where it becomes inefficient or the fuel air mixture is igniting too early and detonates. And once you get that, it's a bad thing. So your car actually has knock sensors it listens, and when it hears pinging, it'll back that off. So a spark 2 advanced at startup will cause kickback. Will cause kickback that can damage the starter. Damage the starter and engine. It can also cause detonation at higher RPM beyond starting. A spark that is too retarded, meaning it's very late, closer to the top dead center, is inefficient, especially at high RPM.